Okay, thank you very much. Here's the complete title of my presentation, which is a bit different from what was printed in the program. From Just War to Just Peace is the title, Recent Developments in Protestant Ethics and Their Educational Implications. So that you know what my background is, I will start with a few remarks. The PowerPoint doesn't run, so I have to leave it again, but I say something about myself in the meantime. I'm working at the University of Tübingen, the Faculty of Theology, and there I am responsible for the training of teachers and pastors, especially for the school subject of religious education. And I'll give it one more try here. And this will maybe help you understand that I have a special interest in the theoretical background of peace education. At this point, I'm not working on a special project, but it is part of my teaching and of my work with my students here. My background, I think now we got it working. My impression is that peace education is in a certain crisis. This is what I want to look at and what I want to consider in this paper, not so much concerning its official standing. Much to my surprise, when I was young, peace education was a counter-cultural effort. It was against the establishment, and now you find it in the official curriculum. So it's become a very official thing. It is in crisis not in terms of its official standing, but in terms of what it should mean, especially in Central Europe. Now, why do I have this impression? I look at some challenges for peace education in Germany today, and doing that, I realize that what I would like to call the formative period of peace education in Germany happened between 1949 and 1989. And it is very characteristic of the understanding of peace education, maybe until today, but only in a special way. It came about in the aftermath of World War II. Peace education meant no more war, and it meant that you had to do it in the face of an ever-present enemy in the East. It was the time of the Cold War. It was the time of the East and West confronting each other, with nuclear deterrence as the epitome of the Cold War, which in the case of Central Europe, Germany, and even my own area, meant that you had nuclear weapons in your own backyard, literally in your own backyard. So you knew what you had to do. You had to rally for a world without nuclear weapons, and you had to find alternatives to armament, which was the focus on non-violent resistance, which was supposed to make us live without weapons, without the protection of armies. Now, after 1989, and this is the point I'm trying to make, after 1989, this paradigm has fallen apart. There was no more close enemy. There was no East Bloc confronting the West. Instead, there was a multiplication of wars all around the world, and it became less and less clear who the aggressor is or was at the time, and what you could do to stop these wars when you were living here in Central Europe. Instead, a new threat came up, 9/11 as the symbol of that new threat of terrorism. Is that also some kind of war, or how does that fit into the picture? A lack of convincing and feasible strategies for peace in an increasingly confusing world. We have a partnership here in Tübingen with an African country. What should I do to support peace there? Cameroon. We heard about it in the first lecture yesterday. What can I do here in Central Europe to support peace in Cameroon? So there is a need for a new basis for religious education for peace. And with that, I turn to Christian ethics and a famous influential statement from the year 2007 from the Protestant Church in Germany, which I use as my test case. What does it help us? The exact title is Living from God's Peace, Working Towards Just Peace. But the most meaningful effort in this publication is a fundamental change of perspectives from just war to just peace, and I will say a little more about what this means in a minute. It has 4 parts. I cannot go into them, but so you can see what it holds. Threats to peace are analyzed, the contribution of Christians and the church, just peace through legal world order, and finally, political tasks. Now, what is the fundamental change of theological perspectives? It really means that the idea of just war is to be given up. Now, what does just war mean? Traditionally, just war meant that you could justify war. However, from the beginning, and the roots of this understanding of just war go back to mostly the Roman times, pre-Christian times, was that war should be regulated, war should be limited, and in war there should be rules for how wars are to be conducted and how your enemies should be treated. Augustine was one of the most famous Christian theologians who developed a theory of just war. Now, in this new statement, the understanding and the groundbreaking insight is that even talking about just war implies that you think war can be justified. And this is wrong. We have to move away from the idea of just war and give up the idea of justifying wars altogether. Instead, we have to focus on the social, economical, cultural, and political presuppositions of peace. The focus must be on peace, not on war. And I do think this is a very important move for all peace education. And for everything I've heard during this conference so far, I think it could be a very important basis. The focus must be on peace and not on war. The publication continues with the idea of limiting war to the most extreme situations, of situations where there are no other means left to defend yourself. In other words, it extends the idea of the right to self-defense to such extreme situations. So that is a little bit of an exception to this focus on peace. Instead, the commitment to worldwide justice is recommended, and especially strengthening world governance. Now, world governance, as you know, means that you are trying to strengthen institutions like the United Nations and other bodies of that kind, and international law that support this kind of world governance. They should come instead of war as peaceful means of conflict resolution. There are possible critical questions against this understanding, and I will just mention a few without discussing them here in detail. Of course, even if you want to limit war to most extreme situations, you can say that there is a continued adherence to the idea of just war and military interventions, because you still think there are cases where this is possible. This is a criticism that comes from pacifism that says this is not really convincing. Another critical point is that the statement does not really assess the current understandings of global governance and the reality of this governance. We all know the United Nations is a wonderful idea. However, it just doesn't work in practice. States, people, presidents defy them. They don't want to follow their rulings. They don't accept them, and they go to war anyway. So what is the reality of global governance, and how much can you expect from that kind of institutions? Interreligious dialogue is mentioned, but it is not given the attention it would deserve. Johannes Lehnemann spoke to that last night with the Initiative of Religions for Peace, and I think more appreciation of that would have been in place. And finally, for our context, I find the attention given to education quite insufficient. Let's look into that part of the publication, and I raised a number of critical questions in this respect as well. In my eyes, the awareness of the pivotal role of peace education is really not there. This may be a typical characteristic of church-related views and statements that they don't consider education so important. The section on education, it entails such a section. You can tell the total is 128 pages and 4 pages are devoted to education. If you look at what they are addressing in these 4 pages, you see, first, education through worship services. Now, if you live in Germany or Central Europe altogether, Arnika was just telling us about how many young Finns don't feel like they belong to a religious community. You're surprised to hear that education should come through worship services because so few young people attend these services. School religious education is not mentioned, however. The second aspect there is the traditions and foundations of Christian peace education, and the famous Czech German philosopher of education, Jan Amos Comenius, is mentioned there. I think that's a good thing to do, to remind us that there are early precursors. Comenius was active in the 17th century during the War of 30 Years. Remind us of figures that had visions of peace education early on, but it does not exactly tell you what you should do today. The third comes closer to what our conference is about: education for peace and justice from early on and throughout the human life cycle. And finally, peace education as a dimension of all ecclesial work. The last two are certainly quite important, but you can tell now we're down to sort of a few paragraphs on these important things. This is what I call insufficient awareness of the pivotal role of peace education. Nevertheless, I think the statement can still work as a new basis for peace education in Germany, motivated and informed by religion. And you remember from how I started out that this is really what I'm interested in. We do need a new basis. We do need a new framework that can explain and make it plausible what peace education is today and what it should do. And I think the core idea is to understand peace education as education for justice in the broadest sense. Now, with this, I come to my last section, perspectives for a new framework for peace education in the field of religious education. You heard yesterday in the beginning with Uli Jäger, they consider peace education as something secular. They first have to rediscover that there's a religious dimension with it. I think that would be another discussion. For me, however, the focus is on peace education in the field of religious education. First of all, I want to clearly state this dual relationship, peace education as a core task of all religious education. When we see education for peace as the core of peace education, this cannot be a special topic. It cannot be a special area of religious education, but it has to be present throughout all religious education. The other, religious education as constitutive for all peace work. That this is not really true at this point can be seen from the statement from the church, which I just quoted in the last section, that this is not automatically understood for us, it is an automatic. I would expect 3 contributions from religious education, which for me now are the main focus of peace education in the 21st century. Education for justice based on the religious traditions and their commitment to justice. I think this is the special contribution that religious education can make to education for justice, to draw on the religious traditions, to find their visions for peace, to make them available to young people today. And I think from the beginning, this conference has done a very good job, for instance, looking at the Quran, finding the peace traditions in Islam and making them available today. So this is a very, very important point. However, it is not just peace, but it must be education for justice, following the understanding that it is not just against war and not for just wars, but for peace and the social presuppositions of peace in the world. The second, which I would like to see appreciated more in this context, is the meaning of interreligious understanding. Of course, Johannes Lehnemann last night was addressing the importance of this dimension as well. And we've heard, for instance, from Arnika just now, how much tolerance, education for tolerance and mutual respect should be addressed as part of peace education. However, I do think that many conflicts in the world do have a religious dimension, even if religion never is the sole cause of the conflicts. But there always, or very often, is a religious dimension. And this is why interreligious understanding is really quite important. Interreligious understanding, however, not just as an abstract idea, but again within the framework of justice. So we're not just talking about intellectual problems of the Trinity or of the unity of God or whatever, but it is really about the contribution to justice that comes out of this kind of education. And third, and I think we haven't really heard much about this, education for reconciliation. From my point of view, and I could say from my Protestant point of view, Lutheran point of view, conflict is something that can never be avoided. Humans will most likely continue to hurt each other. And this is why it is important not just to think about what can be done to prevent conflicts, prevent aggression, but what can be done about reconciling people who used to be enemies. And again, I do think that the religious traditions include special resources and examples of how reconciliation can be achieved, how reconciliation can be supported by education. So in a nutshell, my new basis for religion-related peace education today has three points: education for justice as the main point, the core of everything, interreligious education, and third, enabling reconciliation. Thank you very much.